Welcome. Long time no see. Glad you can make it. Question on the whiteboard for today. What is your favorite season and why? Risk of going with fall, mild temperatures, change in leaves, birthday. Good, good. Um, Me, I gotta go summer. I hate being cold. I enjoy having the longer days, getting to do stuff in the evening, even if it's just like sitting outside. Um, Jimmy going with fall. What about the rest of you? What do you go with? What's your favorite season of the year? Fall or winter for Ness? Go with the cooler seasons. Summer for Jayla. Nice Hunter. Summer birthdays. A break from school. Fair. Deal. Anyone else feel free to share favorite season picks, but go ahead and click over to the vocab slide so people can start jotting that down. Game plan for today. We're gonna do some speed history here. Since we didn't get to have a live class connect at all last week because I was out for testing, what I'm gonna try to do is try to quickly go through the late 1980s through the 1990s, kind of just hitting like the big highlights. What are some of the most important things that were happening during that time period that was kind of shifting America in different directions, things that kind of help better explain aspects of our country today. That is going to necessitate me going through some things pretty quickly, faster than I would like. As we're going through things, obviously feel free to ask any questions about anything. But before we do that, a couple of announcements there on the right. Number one, we are quickly approaching the due date for your family history project. That is due on Sunday. So hopefully you're getting close to wrapping that up, getting that turned in. Obviously, email me if you have any kind of last minute questions on the project. Second, crazy to believe, but we are less than a month away from the end of the school year. May 17th is your last day to turn in any work from this grading period, which for U.S. history, that would be units 5 and 6 in the course. So definitely we're kind of at that point where you want to be, checking your grade, getting missing assignments turned in, all that stuff. Again, obviously send me an email, ask for help if you need it. But then give me one moment here to send out the email to those who are running late, and then we will get going. All right. Okay, so the last live class connect we had was looking at the 1980s and the rise of the Reagan administration, which was really starting to pull government in a more conservative direction. Increasingly that attitude that government was not helping Americans with their challenges. Government was instead an additional barrier, making things difficult. But then one other area of Reagan's administration in terms of foreign policy, in dealing with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, was a renewed focus on an aggressive stance against the Soviet Union. which included dramatically increasing America's military spending, even though America was not actively at war at the time. When you combine that with the Reagan tax cuts, that leads to growing deficits in the U.S. government. The government's spending more money than it's bringing in, but that was putting pressure on the Soviet Union to try to keep up. Could it match America's military spending? Um, Ultimately, that is a contributing factor in the exhaustion of the Soviet Union. Um, Other factors leading to the Soviet Union's exhaustion is growing um, rebellions and independence movements in countries and territories that were part of the Soviet Union. Um, and so going into the 1990s, then we will have the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Um, as the Soviet Union just no longer has the strength to kind of keep everything together. And so parts of the Soviet Union start to break apart as independent countries. Um, the Soviet government votes in favor of a dissolution or a dissolving of the Soviet Union. And so by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union no longer exists. And this is what the Soviet Union instead looks like. Of the countries in orange kind of getting out from under the shadow of the Soviet Union, and all these countries in green, which were at one point directly part of the Soviet Union, now being independent, including the country of Ukraine. That is significant, of course, because today there is a war between Russia and Ukraine, because the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, grew up during the Soviet Union era and very much is trying to like recreate the strength of the Soviet Union. So from Putin's point of view, he feels like Ukraine should be part of Russia. But obviously, a lot of the Ukrainian people disagree, especially since there's a lot of bad history there between Ukraine and Russia. And they, of course, would largely like to remain independent. And hey there, Miguel. Glad you can make it. So as the Soviet Union is collapsing, by that point in time, we have a new president, George H.W. Bush, who was Reagan's vice president. And Bush's response to the fall of the Soviet Union was largely to kind of be hands off, kind of let things play out on their own. Don't get America too involved in things. What do you guys think? Why might that have been the best approach, or what potentially might have been the issue or the problem if America got actively involved in the Soviet Union's collapse? Why might it have been best for America to kind of just hang back and let these events of the collapse of the Soviet Union kind of unfold on their own? Or perhaps think about this. Yeah, Kaylee, absolutely. I was just about to ask a question of, you think about how might the people of the Soviet Union have felt if America more actively was trying to promote the collapse? Um, and exactly, Rissa. Um, Maybe that would have created a feeling of resistance among the Soviet Union and kind of re-energized them to stay together. Um, yeah, basically, Bush didn't want to give the Soviet Union a reason or an excuse to pull itself back together. Kind of just wanted to stand back and be like, look, it kind of fell apart all on its own. You know, we didn't touch anything. You guys did this all on your own. Um, and so, that ended up, looking back on it, probably being the right call. But now that creates an interesting situation where, for basically 50 years, America and the Soviet Union were playing this game of tug of war. Who is the stronger superpower? Well, now with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that means America essentially won that tug of war contest, that America emerged as what sometimes becomes known as the world's hyperpower. Um, Meaning we were kind of at a status of elevated power just above any other country in the early 90s. Um, and so that created new questions around the world of what would America do now? Would it use its elevated power um, for the good of the planet, or would it use that elevated power for its own selfish motivations? Um, Different people in different countries throughout the world kind of had different predictions. Um, Probably can make an argument, a little bit of both, as we go through the 1990s. Um, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, President Bush called for a new world order, uh, basically saying that this was an opportunity for the planet to kind of turn the page and try to build a new world of coexistence. Um, One that, goals were, free from terrorism, um, a stronger sense of justice and peace throughout the world, more cooperation throughout the world. That was kind of Bush's sales pitch to the planet of this idea of a new world order, that America and the rest of the world would be more interconnected in positive ways of working with one another. And so, what kind of became the first major test for the United States of how were we going to handle world events as kind of this singular hyperpower was in the Middle East, specifically in regards to the country of Kuwait. So, if we kind of zoom in on the Middle East here, Kuwait is this tiny little country in purple south of Iraq. And so in the early 90s, the country of Iraq invaded neighboring Kuwait. Because while Kuwait is a tiny little country in terms of size, it's valuable because it has access to a lot of oil within its territory. And so Iraq was looking to invade and take over Kuwait to gain access to more oil. And the leader of Iraq at the time was a dictator by the name of Saddam Hussein. And Hussein assumed that America really wouldn't care if he invaded Kuwait because in the 1980s, America had been working with Saddam Hussein. We, for example, provided Iraq with weapons in its war against Iran. Because after the whole Iranian hostage crisis, the relationship between the United States and Iran is no longer any good. Well, Saddam Hussein miscalculated there. Because throughout the world, this looks like a situation of a bigger country bullying and trying to take advantage of a smaller country that doesn't have the strength to defend itself. And so Bush in the United States opposes the invasion of Iraq trying to take over Kuwait. But Bush does not want to send in America alone to try to defend Kuwait and push Iraq back. He instead wants to bring in a bunch of countries to come and defend Kuwait, what becomes known as a coalition, when you bring a bunch of countries together to kind of be on the same team. Uh, why might he want to do that? Because America could easily take care of this problem on its own. But what might be the benefit of this strategy of bringing a bunch of other countries in to defend Kuwait versus America going in alone to deal with this situation? Any benefits you can think of for America bringing in a bunch of other countries to help out with this? Definitely. One, as Cole says, reduces losses. It's not America just eating all of the losses by itself. That's going to be spread out. Um, Definitely, Jimmy. You're going to have more allies there. You're going to have more support, more backup if needed. Um, in addition to that, how might the rest of the world kind of view things if it's a bunch of countries coming together versus America going in by itself? Why might this potentially be a better look, bringing in a bunch of other countries? Or if it helps you think about it in reverse, how might people view the United States if it was always just America going in alone and taking care of these situations? Or why might some countries have a problem if it was always just America going in alone and responding to world events? Yeah, I agree with that recent one. It's kind of a pleasant surprise of, other countries coming in and helping out too. But then definitely Jimmy, that was kind of a big concern for Bush and his administration, is trying to avoid America having a reputation as kind of being this like global police officer that was going around and telling everyone else what they had to do and how they had to behave. Bush did not want to give the impression that America was trying to take over the world. So, by taking the time to get a bunch of other countries on board, and that's what you see here, any country in blue is a country that helped out in what becomes known as the Persian Gulf War. So then Bush can say, hey, this is not just America policing things. This is a a team effort. This is a bunch of countries saying we need to help Kuwait out, that Iraq is being a bully, and globally, we need to push back against bullies. It's the same reason why when Russia invaded Ukraine, President Biden didn't just want America to respond to that. There's been a lot of effort to get other countries to also push back against Russia, to try to send a message that, hey, this is a global team effort. Um, and so we have what's known as the Persian Gulf War, also known as the First Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm. That Operation Desert Storm is specifically referring to America's military operation in Kuwait, um, which was an overwhelming victory. It takes less than 2 months to basically kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And that ended up being celebrated as a big success in the United States, especially because our last major war was the Vietnam War. So for a lot of Americans, this was kind of um, a moral victory after the embarrassment of our challenges in Vietnam, to the point that some people were pushing to take the war further, that American forces should go into Iraq itself and remove Saddam Hussein from power. But luckily, the Bush administration said no. Our mission was just to protect Kuwait. Our mission was just to get Iraq out of Kuwait. We did what we set out to do. Let's take the victory and go home. Especially because at the time, America did not have a plan that, we could easily go in and kill Saddam Hussein. The US military could do that very easily. But then the question would be, what does America do with Iraq once its leader is gone? Like, how do you fix an entire other country, especially a country that doesn't necessarily want you there fixing them? So luckily, America made the smart call this time of get Iraq out of Kuwait and go home. Shifting over to things going on within the United States. Since the 1970s, when Nixon was president, the US government was engaging in anti-drug operations that became known as the War on Drugs. Going back to the 1960s, we started to see drug use rise throughout the United States. That then included more, acts of violence tied to drug activity, more deaths tied to things like drug overdose. And so there was a lot of pressure for government to do something about the growing drug use in the United States. And under the Nixon administration, that included trying to more aggressively go after drug dealers, but it also included trying to help people overcome their drug addictions. Because basically the logic was that if you're only spending all of your energy trying to go after drug dealers, you might have some victories here or there, but as long as there are still a bunch of people in America who are addicted to drugs, someone new is going to come in to sell them drugs. That, basically, as long as there is still a demand for illegal drugs, even if you were able to get rid of all of the drug dealers in a city, eventually new drug dealers are going to move in because they're like, hey, we can make a lot of money here selling drugs. And so the thought plan under the Nixon administration was, we also need to try to help people overcome their drug addictions. Paying for people to go to rehab and things like that. Because, theoretically, if nobody was addicted to drugs anymore, drug dealing would no longer be a profitable business, and, that would kill the drug trade. Well, then in the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, there was a shift in that thinking, a belief that government needed to get tough, not just on drug dealers, but on drug users. That include passing the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986 that required mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. So basically, if a person got arrested for possessing drugs, they would have to serve a minimum amount of time in jail, regardless of what the situation was. And so what you're seeing here on this chart is the prison population of the United States over time, going back from 1925 all the way up to 2014. And what do you notice about America's prison population in the 1980s? Yeah, it rises, and it rises pretty dramatically. We kind of see a gradual rise in America's prison population over time, but you can really see how in the late 70s through the 80s and 90s, America's prison population exploded, going from, let's say about 200,000 Americans in prison, um, to over a million Americans in prisons. Because, yes, definitely, Jimmy, under the Anti Drug Abuse Act, that included government conducting more drug raids, going after drug users. If a person was found with possession of things like cocaine, heroin, anything like that, they were going to be sent to jail. And so America's prison population explodes, um, which you can also see here. Again, going from the late 1970s through the 80s and 90s, just this dramatic increase in America's prison population. Um, to the point now that when you look at countries with the largest number of prisoners um, per every 100,000 people, America's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, number 6 on the list. So proportionately, America puts a lot more people in jail than a lot of other countries. As part of this effort of government was going to get tough on crime in the United States. Government was going to get tough on drug users in the United States. But there are, of course, also, consequences to that. What does that potentially do to a person's life or to a family if a person is sent to jail for possessing drugs? How does that potentially impact a family if a family member is sent to jail for drug use? Definitely, Riz. It can hurt the family in a lot of ways. One that's difficult for a family to have to wrestle with. A member of their family being a drug addict and going to jail for that. Depending on who the family member is, it can economically hurt the family because now they may not be earning any income from that family member. And in fact, they probably have to pay additional expenses now that that family member is in jail. Um, if that family member is a parent, for children, having a parent now in jail, that's going to be difficult for them. That might lead to challenges for them doing well in school because they're stressed out about having a parent in jail. Um, for the person that goes to jail, obviously that is a difficult experience going to jail. That tends to be something that's changes a person's life. And even once you get out of jail, at that point, then um, it's hard to get your life back on track because now you have a criminal record. So trying to find a job becomes difficult. Trying to find housing becomes difficult. Yes, statistically, once a person goes to jail once, they're a lot more likely to go to jail again, um, and engage in more criminal activity. And so, as aggressively as the government was throwing people in jail for drug related crimes, um, it ultimately was not solving the drug problem in the United States. And we're just, now starting to see the government reevaluate what it was doing in the 80s and the 90s. That it doesn't seem like it's an issue that you can just jail your way to a solution. That instead it requires perhaps doing the hard work of actually trying to help people overcome their drug addiction, rehabilitation centers, things like that. We also continue to see ongoing racial challenges in the United States, especially in regards to the relationship between um, police officers and African American communities. Because as we've previously talked about, historically, when you had racially discriminatory laws, police officers were the ones in charge of enforcing those laws, which oftentimes created a lot of tension um, in African American communities. Or, for example, as the government was conducting its war on drugs, oftentimes the government would focus on drug use in largely African American neighborhoods. And so that also created a lot of tension between law enforcement and African Americans. And so in March of 1991, Los Angeles police officers um, tried to pull over an African American man, Rodney King. He does not immediately pull over, so there is a vehicle pursuit. Um, and then by the time police officers do get King to pull over, that's created a lot of tension there. And so the LA police pull King out of his car um, and very aggressively beat him while he is lying defenseless on the ground, which just so happens to be videotaped. And then that videotape is given to the press and shown on news. And so people across the country saw this event of LA police very aggressively attacking an unarmed African American man, which had long been a concern within the African American community, that it oftentimes seemed like law enforcement would be more aggressive or take more dramatic steps in responding to criminal activity, um, or even just interactions with African Americans versus white Americans. What had long been the challenge for African American communities, though, was not having proof. Um, it would often be, an issue of, one person said this, one person said that. That you would have an African American person say, I was mistreated by the police. And then the police would respond by saying, no, we didn't. And then more often than not, most Americans would believe the word of the police officer over the word of the African American person who was potentially suspected as, for criminal activity or something like that. So, but by the 1990s, technology is changing. More people are having access to technology to record events as they're happening. Nowadays, everyone can record video, because everyone has a cell phone on them. Back then, we weren't quite to that point, but you started to have more people that traveled around with these videotape recorders. They were big, they were bulky, but they did allow everyday people to record video footage of events in real time. And so there was a lot of hope within African American communities that, okay, this time we actually have video evidence of this issue we've long been talking about. Hopefully, this will be the time where something gets done about it. That we make some changes to how law enforcement interacts with African Americans. And so 4 police officers are put on trial for excessive force. Ultimately, all 4 of them are found not guilty, which for a lot of African Americans across the country was a very painful moment of this ongoing issue of law enforcement not treating African Americans fairly and now getting away with it, that there would be no consequences for them. And so in LA, that unfortunately led to race riots as African Americans throughout the city of LA rioted, which included breaking into stores and offices, looting, burning different areas of the city down to the ground. And so what the 92 LA riots kind of illustrated was that the country still had work to do with race relations in the United States. There was kind of this growing belief among some Americans that the civil rights movement had fixed everything, that racism was no longer a problem in the United States, that everything was good now. And so what the Rodney King incident in the 92 LA riots kind of illustrate is, no, there is still ongoing tension. There are still difficult conversations the country needs to have and dealing with the ongoing racial divisions that existed in the United States. But heading then into the 92 presidential election. At the start of 92, George Bush was incredibly popular, especially after the victory in Operation Desert Storm. Yet ultimately, he will lose re-election in 92 to Bill Clinton because economically, the country was struggling. There was a large stock market crash in 1987. It didn't quite lead to something like the Great Depression, but that was economically shaky. There was a growing government deficit. The government was continuing to spend more money than it was bringing in. And there was a growing concern that that was going to lead to an economic crisis. And that the way to fix that was to raise taxes. The problem is that Bush, when he first ran for president in 88, had made a promise that he would not raise taxes. But recognizing that the government was heading towards an economic crisis if it didn't raise taxes, Bush ultimately agreed to compromise with Democrats in Congress to a combination of raising taxes and decreasing government spending. It was a hard choice for him to make because it arguably is what prevented him from winning re-election as president, as a lot of people were upset that he broke his promise to not raise taxes. But it arguably was the right thing for him to do as president in order to avoid a bigger economic crisis. As ultimately the 92 election ended up being very close. But ultimately the Democratic candidate, Bill Clinton, winning in 92. The 92 elections are also significant because they're also known as being the year of the women. due to several women winning Senate races, increasing the number of female senators in Congress from two to six, um, including the first black female senator, um, Carol Mosley Brown. Uh, Now, ultimately, the Senate is made up of 100 senators. So, 6 out of 100 ultimately is not a lot. And so that kind of says a lot of, kind of where American politics was in terms of gender at the time. That, you go from 2 female senators to 6 female senators, and that's kind of celebrated as being the year of the woman. Um, it was a step in the right direction of greater gender balance in US government, but clearly at 6 out of 100, there was still a long ways to go. What ultimately motivated a significant number of women to run for government in 92 was that earlier there was a new nomination to the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas, who's actually still on the Supreme Court to this day. And as the process of Thomas's nomination was going forward, a woman who worked with Thomas, Anita Hill, came forward with allegations of sexual harassment in the workplace, that Clarence Thomas repeatedly behaved in an inappropriate manner with Anita Hill at work. And so she went before Congress to give her side of the story of what happened. Clarence Thomas denied all of it, so it kind of became a he said, she said situation, with ultimately Congress believing the word of Clarence Thomas over the word of Anita Hill. And Clarence Thomas ultimately gets put on the Supreme Court. And so for a lot of women across America, that was kind of an illuminating moment, that there was still this ongoing issue of people not taking women seriously, including when they come forward with events of sexual harassment. And so it motivated a growing number of women to say, we need to actually be running for government. It's not just enough to vote in elections. We need to actually have women in positions of government. And it's part of a growing pattern of more diversity in Congress. Historically, Congress has been made up of white men, typically older white men. But as you can see here, as we kind of get into the 90s, we start to see Congress become more diverse, more women, more African Americans, more Latinos, Asian Americans. But we also then start to see a political divide, as the vast majority of this diversity in Congress is going to come from the Democratic Party, compared to what we see within Republican members of Congress. And that's still a pattern that we see to this day. It's gotten better. It's not quite as dramatic of a divide, but you still see that gender divide to this day. Let's see, we're running short on time, so trying to hit some other things here that you wouldn't have necessarily caught in the videos. So with Bill Clinton now being president in the 1990s, what starts to become a major political issue in American politics, and it's one that still is very much an area of focus today is immigration. Um, because in the 90s, we start to see an increase in immigration to the United States, specifically from Central American and South American countries, with a growing number of those immigrants coming into the country while bypassing the legal process of becoming an immigrant of the United States. In part because that system um, really starts to struggle to handle the number of people wanting to come into the United States. There are a limited number of courts to handle all of that, and so a lot of people in frustration say, "I don't have the time to wait. We're going to figure out a way to get in one way or another." Um, Part of this is also due to changing economic realities in Central and South America. A lot of farm jobs are going to start to disappear in Central America. And so those Central American farm workers are then going to start looking to come to the United States to do work in America instead, which is going to lead once again to a rise of nativism in the United States, a fear that these immigrants are coming into the United States and taking or stealing American jobs. Now, oftentimes, the jobs that these immigrants are doing are jobs that established Americans don't particularly want to do in the first place, like working out in the farms of the Western United States, picking grapes um, and other produce, or doing house cleaning services, or serving as housekeepers, nannies, things like that. Um, but as Republicans were looking for something to go after Bill Clinton, um, to kind of take down his presidency, immigration kind of becomes a major topic of conversation, which was really kind of a dramatic turn, because just a few years earlier, back when Republican Ronald Reagan was president, he had signed a law that granted amnesty to illegal immigrants in the United States. So there had previously been this pattern of Democrats and Republicans compromising on immigration laws. Um, but increasingly, that is not going to be the case. During the Clinton years, Republicans also spent a lot of time conducting investigations into Bill Clinton, trying to find something they could, kind of point the finger at and say, this is not a good president, or this is a president who's been abusing his political power. Those investigations went on for years. Nothing substantial really came out of them. Um, but then we also see, at the start of Clinton's presidency, a new piece of conversation regarding LGBTQ rights. Um, as when Clinton was running for president, at one point, he had made a comment that he would potentially be open to the idea of ending the military ban on homosexual serving. Um, well, once Clinton becomes president, conservatives immediately go after Clinton for even suggesting the idea, with members of Congress threatening that they will block all legislation if Clinton makes any effort to lift the ban. And so Clinton tries to find a compromise by creating a new policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. a policy where homosexuals could serve in the military as long as they didn't identify themselves as being gay. So basically, as long as you kept being gay a secret to yourself, you could now serve in the US military, which was Clinton trying to find a compromise, but it was kind of a compromise that made everyone unhappy. Members of the LGBTQ community felt unhappy because they felt like they had to keep a part of themselves hidden, that they kind of had to feel shameful about being gay. Conservatives weren't happy about it because now they're worried that you have all of these secret homosexuals serving in the military, and they were worried that that would ruin America's military strength. Obviously, it does not, but that was the fear at the time, as you still had a lot of prejudice against homosexuals in the United States. As we can see here, looking at charting Americans' opinions towards gay marriage in the United States. Back in the 90s, basically only a fourth of Americans approved of gay marriage. Um, we've made a lot of progress over time. Nowadays, roughly 70% of Americans approve of gay marriage. That's kind of a dramatic change in a relatively short amount of time, historically speaking. But I see we're unfortunately out of time, so we will have to stop there for today. As always, if you have any questions, stick around, let me know. Again, I apologize that we kind of had to go through a lot of stuff quickly. Um, Otherwise, I will see you back here on Thursday. You were good to go. Thanks, Rissa. See ya. Bye, Jimmy.